I want to thank you for inviting us. Chris and I are both very excited to be here today. And we look forward to sharing what we know about team effectiveness with everybody and also learning a little bit from you guys. So we've done a lot of work in teams. However, I will note up front, neither Chris nor I are D&I researchers. So it's very exciting for us to think about how some of this stuff may apply to the work that you guys are doing. To begin with this first session, what I'm going to do is really give you a very high-level overview, kind of like this 50,000 foot view. One of the things that we know is very important within teams is to kind of set the groundwork, right? And to make sure that when we're talking, we're kind of beginning to speak the same language. So that's kind of the goal of this first session, noting that we've got a wide variety of different disciplines on the phone. One of the first things I want to do is kind of just, go over briefly the team landscape, talk to you about a few key terms, what we mean. I'll talk to you a little bit about some of the frameworks that we use. And this will help you guys to interpret as Chris and I are talking throughout the day and hopefully begin to form some common languages. Next, I'll talk about some drivers of team effectiveness, leveraging some work of some of our colleagues. And then lastly, kind of how do you take these drivers that contribute to effective teamwork and translate those into action? So kind of how do we put them together? Through the remainder of the workshop, what you'll see is we'll go into much more detail on particular aspects. And like was already mentioned, this is really across these 2 days, we're really just kind of hitting the high points. And so hopefully some of the resources that we've provided will help you to dive a little bit deeper, but hopefully this will serve as a foundation. So teams are good, teams are great. I'm a teams researcher, they're awesome. However, that's often if you've had a good experience with teams, that's often what you say. If you've had a bad experience, well, we know that they don't always perform well. However, one of the reasons they don't perform well is what tends to happen, and we do this a lot, even when we think about putting together research teams, or we're going after proposal, or on the implementation side of things, I'm looking for partners to work with. The first thing we think about is task expertise. And so what we see a lot of times is people bring a lot of really smart people together, they put them on a team, and they go, you know what, we've all been part of a team before, they'll figure it out. They'll figure out how to work together. Just having the task expertise is enough. And what we know from time and time again, task expertise forms like the foundation. However, to be effective within a team, the members really need to know how to collaborate and coordinate and work together. So that's some of what we'll talk about today. Let's see if I can make that minimized. Really what we're trying to do is, if any of you guys have kids or you've maybe seen the Lego movie, everything's awesome. We're trying to go make sure that we stay somewhere around the awesome realm and not move into there being so much angst and conflict within the team that you feel more like Jack Nicholson and you never want to see these people again. Maybe that's a little extreme, but you get frustrated. So with that, what I want to do is kind of start with the basics. So when we talk about a team, what are we really talking about? What's it mean to be a team? Okay. So when you hear Chris and I speak about teams, what you're going to see is that, I've got the chat up. All right, what you're going to see is when we think about teams, here's the definition, the formal definition, but I want to pull out a couple things here. So we're talking about a set of 2 or more individuals. They're working dynamically, which means they're working together. They're working interdependently, and this is a really big thing for teams. The idea that there's interdependence, that in order to accomplish my goal, we really need to work together. It can't be, think of like a brainstorming group not a brainstorming group, but it can't be an instance where I can be just as successful if I do it on my own, but I really need to be relying on those other team members. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. The other thing is they're working adaptively towards a common goal. Okay, now that does not mean that members don't have sub goals. Sometimes they do, especially when we start thinking about teams within teams. So if you think about an implementation team, and maybe that intervention that you're focusing on is happening across schools, right? So you've got teams at both of those schools that are trying to work together. Hopefully there's this common goal and the success of whatever the intervention is. However, because they're operating at different schools, they probably have their own, particular sub goals within there. So it doesn't negate the fact that there's There's sub goals, but there is at least a common valued goal that they're all working towards. The third thing that I want to pull out is that they operate in a multi-level context. And what that means for us is that when we think about what makes teams effective, we need to think about the input side. So for us, it's individuals, what are the individual characteristics of the members themselves? It's the task characteristics, and we'll talk some about that. But they're also nested within organizations, right? So you think of an academic science team, we're all nested within our universities, and that places some constraints on what we can and can't do. Same thing if you have academic community partnerships, right? The organizations that we're nested within have some impact and constraints on us. So we need to think about that. And then lastly, there are a number of taxonomies that are out there in the literature that talk about the different types of characteristics and dimensions that exist within teams that basically give you different types of teams. So the second thing that you'll hear Chris and I talk about today is the importance of context. So I wanted to pull this up. This next part, if you look on the table that's towards the bottom of the slide, you can see some of the ways, not all the ways, but some of the ways that teams may vary, just to get you guys thinking about this. So we can have, very diverse teams. They can be very homogeneous. They can be heterogeneous. They could vary on their culture, cultural values. They can vary on their personality, as examples. We also have, which is another type of diversity, what's called integration here. And that's kind of expanded out on this right-hand or my right-hand side of the slide, where we can think about, how many disciplines are making up this team. So on the simplest slide, we have, maybe somebody working on a research proposal, let's say, and they're all psychologists, right? Or they're all mental health professionals. That's probably very rare anymore. Really what we see time and time again is this push from science, and it was alluded to earlier, moving towards more of this transdisciplinary notion where you're taking people from different disciplines that are working together, and you can think about the community partnerships, they bring another discipline to this. And really by integrating and combining their efforts, they come up with something that's fundamentally different than what they could do if they stayed kind of in their silos. We can talk about differences in team size, the degree to which members are co-located or distributed. Right now, almost everybody's distributed, but that wasn't always the case before the pandemic. The degree to which goals are aligned. We can also talk about boundaries. So to what degree does my team have stable boundaries? I know it's going to be the same people every single time, and that has some implications in terms of team process versus on the other end, how fluid are they? Members kind of coming in and out. And then lastly is the degree of task interdependence. So how tightly do we have to coordinate with one another? And I'll talk about that a little bit more. This is just another slide to kind of highlight some of that. And I think this is one of the references in the workbook that we gave. But this is thinking about science teams. And you can see that you move from, we're doing very kind of basic research on the left-hand side here. And in that case, you might have just interdisciplinary, but they're all academics. And moving to the right, as you start to get more into implementation science and more into practice and applying what we know, then we get into these more complex types of teams where you not only have a mixture maybe of different disciplines from an academic standpoint, but now you've got the experts from the community, those people that have their boots on the ground and every day they're dealing with the problems that us academics are trying to solve, right? So how do you integrate across these? So up to this point, I've kind of laid out some very broad things. And when we think about, I'm going to kind of transition to talking a little bit more about how teams work together. So when we talk about teamwork, what you'll hear Chris and I talk about kind of throughout are differences between processes. And if you read the literature, you'll see this is a big distinction. Processes are the cognitive, the verbal, the behavioral activities that team members do that helps them to organize their task work so that they can achieve their collective goals. So this is stuff like, this is what you would normally probably think about when you think about a team. So it's stuff like leadership, communication, coordination, decision-making. They're fairly dynamic. They change, they change pretty often. They go up or down depending on how the team is doing. And then we have the second class of activities that are known as emergent states. And these tend to be, for the most part, attitudinal or cognitive in nature. And they do change, but they don't change as quickly. And they can serve to impact our processes, or they can serve as an outcome of that. What I mean by that, we'll take one such as trust. So trust is something that changes over time based on my experiences with my team. It's going to change. I also have a certain amount of trust that I come into the team with based on what I know about those people. So that's an example of an emergent state. And we'll talk about some of those as we go through. The other thing that you'll see within the team the other thing that you'll see within the team literature is when we talk about how this stuff fits together. We talk about teamwork is what you see in the middle of this. So that label of processes and the emergent states. And there's more than that, but those are a sampling of them. But we also consider what's happening on the front end, what's driving how effective and what processes are needed. And those are the inputs. So you'll hear us talk a little bit as we go through. I'll talk about team composition when I'm talking about leadership. Team size is another factor, and we'll go into great detail. We'll talk about team leadership, both serving as an input based on the extreme impact that they can have on teams, but it's also a process. And then how the team works together contributes to the outcomes. And we can see here, if you're talking about an academic setting, it might be published articles or grant submissions. If we're talking about those academic community partnerships, it might be the success of that intervention that you're working on. Now, this looks not too bad. And this next slide, we're not going to go into detail. I just want to show you, this is why teams don't always work. So this is one of many team models, or it's actually a combination of models that are out there in the literature. And all these, I've tried to put references on the bottom if you want more detail on some of these things. But what you can see here is on the left-hand side, we've got things we think about in terms of inputs, things that can impact how the team's working together. Why it's not as simple as just putting a whole bunch of experts on the team. So we think about member characteristics. Your expertise is that first one, task, knowledge, skills, and ability. We think about team characteristics. We think about what is it about the task that's important, and we also think about what is it about the work. All that stuff serves to impact how teams work together, which is this middle portion of this figure, and then that leads to, you can see some of the different types of outputs that we talk about within teams. Now, invariably, teams don't always perform well. We're human, right? There's human beings on there, so we kind of ebb and flow. But when teams start to falter, there's a number of team interventions, some of which I'll talk about, some of which Chris will talk about later on, that we can use to help bring the team back up to a place where they are able to better coordinate together through that development of kind of shared knowledge, shared behaviors, and shared affect. All right. So enough of kind of the high level theoretical stuff. What I wanted to kind of do now that we've kind of set some of the stage is to go into kind of what is it that actually underlies team performance. And at the end of the day, it's very simply team performance is comprised of, I normally say the ABCs, and I realize my things are flip-flopped here, so I've got CBAs, but it's comprised of attitudes, how do members feel, the behaviors that they engage in, so what are they doing, and then the knowledge component, which is what they're thinking. And while there are a number of taxonomies that are out there, we're going to leverage this one that's been developed by Ed Salas and some of his colleagues, goodness gracious, over a number of years. Most recently, they've taken all these and kind of published them in a book. And it's a great book and it's very applied. But I like this because it serves to take a lot of the different constructs, the different processes and states that we talk about within teams, and it provides an organizing framework. So Ed would say, these are the 7 C's. So you kind of got that mnemonic to kind of help you remember things. So what I'm going to do is right now kind of briefly go through what some of these are. And then again, like I said, as we go through the workshop, you'll hear more about a lot of these. So the first C, capability, just refers to, do we have the right mix of people on the team? And you think about this from a compositional kind of standpoint, not It's not only, do we have smart people, but how do those smart people combine? We know that, for example, agreeableness and conscientiousness are great personality characteristics to have on a team. We know that adaptability and psychological safety is something you'll hear Chris and I talk about a lot. So it's a kind of like a climate variable that talks about how safe is the team for interpersonal risk taking. So that's the first one. The second C deals with the attitudes. So what are the beliefs and attitudes that we know are important within teams? And the reason that these are important is because they serve as motivation, right? This is what directs team effort and allows them to actually take those behaviors and enact them. So we talk a lot about collective efficacy, which is how much the shared belief that my team can accomplish the tasks that you set out. So, we can get this proposal done by the deadline, and we think we're going to be successful. Team cohesion deals with the degree to which I feel bonded to that team, and is very important as we start getting under stressful circumstances, as it sometimes allows us to go and do, to stick in there when otherwise we kind of give up, right? I feel an identity with the team, and I don't want to disappoint anybody. Psychological safety and mutual trust, I kind of alluded to. Psych safety, there was a report by Google not too long ago that they found this to be like huge within their teams. And I think it's really a big one for when we're talking about collaborations, where either you're dealing with complex problems or where you really have these multidisciplinary teams coming together. Because one of the cool things about multidisciplinary teams, whether we're talking about science teams or the community academic partnership, is the fact that you've got a wide variety of expertise, and you put these people on there because you want to leverage that. The only way you're going to leverage that is if people feel comfortable speaking up within the team, and that's what psychological safety is about. It's about a climate where interpersonal risk-taking is, where you feel safe with interpersonal risk-taking. So I can say something and no one's going to say, hey, what are you thinking? Or, roll their eyes at me. I can ask, what? Hey, I don't know what that acronym means, or I don't know what that term means. Can you help me understand? That's essential when we start talking about these multidisciplinary teams. And the last one is collective orientation, which is basically just some people like working in teams, some people don't. So that's something we think about too. I think I'm on the third C now. So this is kind of the meat of what we talk about. These are the behaviors. So what are the types of behaviors that allow teams to come in and coordinate their actions as they're working towards their outcomes? I think that might be, okay, that's the last one. Now there are a number of these. This is just a sampling of some of the big ones. So mutual performance monitoring. So one of the cool things about teams when they work well is that members, because there's that climate of trust, members can monitor one another, and they recognize, because they understand what's going on, they recognize when maybe other members don't understand or they're getting overloaded. And so using this mutual performance monitoring, they can then kind of step in and say, you know what, I can help you out. And sometimes that helping out is just purely verbal. And other times, depending on the team and the makeup, it's actually stepping up and taking some of that workload off team members. Given the constraints that we're in anymore and the complex problems, adaptability is essential. No plan, especially if you're dealing with trying to implement something into a real life organization, no plan survives first contact. At least that's been my experience, is there's always some degree of adaptability. And especially when you're doing this academic community partnerships, one of the really cool things is, as academics, we bring what we know from the science. However, the community partners bring a wealth of expertise in terms of what's going on in a day-to-day basis. And in working with them, that's how you figure out how can we take what we know and adapt it such that it works. We want to do something that's feasible, that's practical. And so adaptability is key to that kind of give and take. Team leadership, I'll talk about a little bit later today. Task-related assertiveness is this idea of being, again, able to speak up and offer your opinions in a assertive but not detrimental manner, I guess. Conflict resolution, teams are going to have conflict. I've never been on a team, or very few teams, that are actually truly working together that don't have conflict. Good teams manage that conflict and try to keep it focused on the task itself and don't let it dissolve into personal or relationship conflict. Last one here is closed loop communication. And that's really important on multidisciplinary teams because it talks about, I say something to you and then you acknowledge receipt of my message, but it also allows me to get a gauge on whether or not you actually understood what I was saying. Okay, I'm going to assume that's just making sure there's nothing in that. Okay, I want to make sure there wasn't anything in the chat that I was supposed to be paying attention to. All right, the next C, which is number 4, deals with communication. Chris is going to talk an awful lot about this when he talks about tools for building teams, because communication is very, very important for that information and exchange of ideas. So here we're just talking about, do members communicate effectively with not only the internal team, but with the people outside the team, their constituents, if you will, the people outside the team who, number one, might have key information that impacts the team and gives them some idea of, do they need to adapt some of their processes, but it also lets people know what the team is doing. Some of the things that we know here, we know that more is not always better. So when we look at communication, just because a team is talking a lot does not mean that it's a good team. Oftentimes it's actually the exact opposite. They may be talking more because they don't understand what's going on. So it depends on what's being said. We also know that it's important to, like I just said, so communication both inside the team and then to have boundary spanners that can connect that team with other either important teams or with external people in the community or environment. Closed loop communication, I talked about. When we're talking about multidisciplinary teams, I think it's important to try and avoid discipline-based jargon. Discipline-based jargon is great when we're in our own little silos and working within our disciplines because it can promote efficiency in communication. But as we start crossing boundaries, it becomes a lot harder because your acronym may not mean the same thing as my acronym. So we do a lot of work with the military, and like one of our organizations in my discipline is SIOP, Society for Industrial Organizational Psychology. If I go and say that to a military person, it means a totally different thing. And even, there's even been times when we've been coordinating within the academic community where some of my partners, we use the same term. And then as we begin to talk about it, we realize it doesn't mean the same thing because they're coming from a different discipline. So, and the last thing on here is the sharing of unique information. So within teams, what we see a lot of times is that people tend to share common information, and we want to promote the sharing of unique information. And there's some of the cognitive stuff that we'll talk about later can help with that. Some challenges. So why isn't communication easy? There are a host of them. And I'm sure if you guys think back to the teams that you have, whoops, always go too far. Think back to the teams that you've been on and you can think of some of these. So, changing membership, changing tasks, it makes it hard for everybody to stay on the same page. Distance, we've all been working now for what, almost a year. It feels like longer than that. But anyway, a while now, remotely with our colleagues at a distance. That makes it hard for a number of reasons, especially if you're trying to form a new team. How do you develop trust? How do you make sure that some of the communications, are interpreted the way you mean them? How do you build identity at a distance? Let's see, hierarchy, so power differences within teams can sometimes make communication challenging. Move on. So number 5, the 5th driver is cognition. And this one's a big one. We talk about this a lot, especially when we are dealing with teams that when they make a mistake, it's like a big deal, like it could seriously, and they're working under pressure. So team cognition refers to, do the team members have a shared understanding? Here it's about, do they have a shared understanding of the roles and expectations for the team? One of the things that we see often is that sometimes when teams don't work, it's because there's not clear expectations about what everybody's roles and responsibilities are. And Chris will talk more about that. And it's a fairly easy fix. We know that teams need to have what's called shared mental models regarding, is there agreement or a shared understanding? Doesn't have to be total agreement. Is there a shared understanding about what are their goals? What is their task? What are people's roles and responsibilities? And more importantly, within teams, how do they intersect? Where are the coordination points? And lastly, one of the really cool things about teams, and especially when you're talking about these multidisciplinary teams, is that, everybody doesn't need to know everything, and everybody shouldn't know everything. That's why we have brought together people with different types of expertise. However, what team members do need to know, there needs to be a shared understanding in terms of who has what expertise. That helps me to push information so that communication is more efficient. And it also helps me to weight the information that I get back from my team members, and that's known as transactive memory. Okay. Coaching, this is essentially leadership behaviors. We'll talk about those more this afternoon. Just all I'm going to say here is that leadership behaviors are very important. And from a team standpoint, it doesn't have to only be done by a formal assigned leader. We often have multiple people engaging in the leadership activities to take advantage of different types of expertise. I'll talk more about that. And then this last one, conditions, is recognition of the fact that that the environment that teams operate in have an impact on them. So the question is, am I operating in a favorable context? And what that means, do I have the right resources? That can be task resources, that can be time availability, that can be equipment, personnel. Does the team have some degree of autonomy? And their work environment comes into play here. So degree of autonomy leaves the team some leeway to adapt. And the work environment can be conducive or not. Same thing with organizational policies. Is the organization rewarding team type of activities? And then lastly is kind of the team climate stuff, which is the psychological safety as one of those, in building positive norms. So if we take all these things, let's see if I can wrap these up in about 3 minutes. If we take all these things and how do they combine together to make an expert team? So we don't want a team of experts, we want an expert team. So number one, we know that expert teams possess clear roles and responsibilities. This helps them to manage expectations. It helps them to understand where people's roles intersect, therefore better coordination. Expert teams have a clear shared vision. It promotes a common purpose, which is motivational. It lets the team members know, where do they need to be going. It provides direction. They need to have strong adaptive leadership. So leadership skills need to go beyond just being really good in the technical aspect of, whatever your problem space is. So if it's a research thing, I need to be more than just a good researcher or a good engineer. Strong adaptive leadership serves to foster teamwork. They develop team members, and they really work to create this learning environment, which is comprised of psychological safety, of the leader kind of self-correcting and modeling the behavior that they want the team to do, and then showing team members that they, that they're benevolent, they do care. Nobody wants a leader that they perceive is going to stab them in the back. Expert teams also create mechanisms to cooperate and coordinate. Mental models are some of those, but they also identify teamwork and task work requirements. They use those requirements and the competencies of the members on the team to adaptively manage tasks and workload. And then they purposely integrate new team members. So we know, sometimes you have a new team member come in, it could be on a proposal, or as team members come in and out with academic community partnerships and the implementation of things, making sure that someone's taking the time to socialize that team member, bring them in, make them feel part of the team, as well as establishing and transmitting all those team norms. Expert teams, they also hold, so this is the cognitive part, they hold shared mental models. We've kind of talked about that already, but that allows members to anticipate one another and allows implicit coordination, which is coordination when I don't have the freedom of telling you exactly what I'm going to do. Right, the stereotypical example of this is the blind pass in basketball. And there are some situations where implicit coordination is really needed. Expert teams optimize resources. So they're really a learning entity. They self-correct, they compensate for one another, and they're able to reallocate functions. Expert teams, I think I've got two more. So expert teams develop a strong sense of trust, cohesion, and confidence in themselves. So these are the attitudinal components. And then the last two, and then I'm done because I'm a little bit over time, but expert teams engage in this cycle of briefing, which Chris will talk about a little bit, the importance of team contracts. Then they engage in their performance, and then they debrief. They reflect on what went well and what didn't go well and how they can improve. And the performance doesn't have to be the end of the proposal, right? It can be somewhere along the way. And I'll talk about debriefs an awful lot when I talk about sustaining teams. The last thing, I'm just going to highlight this. There are a number of things that we can do that exist out there that talk about what can we do to either build and or maintain team effectiveness. Chris and I will touch on these as we go through the next couple of days. Some of these, like team composition and team charters, you'll hear Chris talk about team charters, and they really come in on the front end. So what can we do when we're initially building our teams or putting them together? Team building deals a lot with building affect and some of those affective dimensions and goal setting. And then what you see on the bottom here are different instances of teamwork training that are mostly focused on processes, either leadership or crew resource management is something that came out of aviation, is now being used within the oil industry and medical, that deals basically with things such as decision-making, assertiveness, coordination, and communication. All right. Last slide. So take-home messages from my portion. There's a difference between a team of experts and an expert team. Task work and teamwork processes are different. Both are needed. By the way, if they're not good at their task work, it's very hard to bring in teamwork. Team processes often tend to be neglected because everybody thinks they'll just happen, but they don't. And that there's a wide variety of tools out there that we can use to facilitate team effectiveness. And then Chris will talk more about the measurement component, so I won't go into that one.